We're going to review this wet dry sharpener. This is the WEN BG4270 10-inch wet dry sharpener. Although this review is going to go a little bit different than my other review videos because unlike other reviews where I've used the tool for quite some time and then reviewed it, I just bought this tool. It was sort of an impulse purchase, and quite frankly, I didn't do really any research on the tool before I bought it, which is a little uncharacteristic of me, so I'm anxious to see how it performs. So I'm going to unbox it, put it together, do some calibration checks, sharpen a plane blade, a chisel, a couple knives, and then end with my likes and dislikes. So what is a wet dry sharpener? Well, there's a wet component, which is a grinding wheel that spins through a bath of water continuously. Two advantages to that. One, it keeps your blade of whatever you're sharpening nice and cool, so you're never going to ruin or lose the hardness. Two, it captures the dust and metal shavings that are produced when you grind and takes them and deposits them in the water bath, which is healthier for you. And then there's the dry component, which is a leather stropping wheel. A stropping wheel really gets you a polished, honed, and more durable edge on the blade that you're sharpening. So that's what a wet-dry system entails. So to the unboxing. I have a helper with me today, and we're going to take this apart and show you everything you get. First, you get a manual, obviously. Then you get an angle guide, which has common angles for various tools, which is kind of nice. You also get a tube of honing paste, grit unknown. You also get a hand plane blade and chisel jig, which I will go into more detail about in a sec. Then you get 4 knobs. Those knobs are used to attach this universal support with a fine adjustment nut. You also get a grinding wheel, which is rated for 220 grit, but can be dressed to other grits. I'll explain that in a sec. And then you get a water reservoir. Here's the actual unit itself. It's fairly stout, around 36 pounds with everything on it. It has 2 directions, forward and backward, which is kind of neat. The leather stropping wheel comes attached to it. And it also has 4 rubber feet on the bottom of the unit to protect whatever you're sitting it on. So here's everything that comes with it all laid out. Everything was there, nothing was damaged. And this is a fairly impressive haul for the price, I think. I'm going to modify this reservoir. The grinding wheel goes through the reservoir and deposits the metal that's removed from the blade that you're sharpening into this basin. And that sounds great until it comes time to clean the thing and you have to dump water with a whole bunch of metal shavings down your drain. Very bad. So what I'm going to try is attach 2 pieces of magnet, one on the bottom here and one right here, in the hopes that those magnets capture a lot of the metal shavings to make the cleanup a little easier. So I have this roll of magnet, I have 2-part epoxy, and I have some clamps. First step is to cut the magnet to length. I chose to make it exactly the length of my jaws of my clamp, just so I get nice, even clamping pressure. After that, it's just a matter of mixing up the 2-part epoxy. Little side note, I really prefer to use this 2-part epoxy that comes in 2 separate tubes as opposed to the one that has the plunge for both, because I feel I get much more control out of this stuff, and the other stuff kind of messy and I never really get good results with it. So anyway, I'm going to rough up the inside of the reservoir with some sandpaper right where I put the magnet in the hopes I get better glue adhesion. I put the magnet right there, I throw the clamp on it, and I let the thing sit for 24 hours to let the epoxy fully cure and harden. So checking out the specs, this thing has a 1.6 amp motor. It spins at 115 rotations per minute. That's about 2 rotations a second. The grinding wheel is 10 inches, but the stropping wheel is a little bit smaller at 8 inches. Speaking of the stropping wheel, it is very much a piece of leather. I am not a leather expert, but it is leather. It is leather continuous throughout. There are no tears, which is nice. The grinding wheel itself had one little nick when it came to me. Other than that, it seems to be in very good shape. No cracks, no tears, nothing of concern. Very stout, impressively well milled, if I may say so myself. That little nick should come off within a session or 2. To attach that grinding wheel, you pop off the lock nut and the flange. You put the wheel on, and then you reattach that flange and the lock nut. For lock nuts, you really have to use a wrench because they can't be hand tightened. So get a wrench and make sure that lock nut seats fully against the flange and give it a little shake just to make sure there's no wiggle. So I'm going to turn this on and run it in the forward orientation or the forward direction. The grinding wheel doesn't seem to have any wobble whatsoever. The stropping wheel, on the other hand, definitely has a little bit of wobble. I tried to troubleshoot this to no avail. Going to run it in reverse and checking out the grinding wheel in the opposite direction. Still looks very, very good. The stropping wheel still looks very, very shaky. So now I'm going to check out this universal support. This is the thing that you attach your sharpening jigs to, and you can also use this as a straight up rest to place the thing you're sharpening on as you sharpen it. I'm checking out to see how parallel this thing is with the wheel just by the eye test, and you can see here that's pretty parallel right there. When it's a little higher, it's kind of hard to eyeball how parallel it is. So I took two very reliable squares and placed them on the wheel and on the bar. And if they're parallel, these two things should line up just flush. There's a little tiny gap at the top. It's kind of even hard to see. But if that bothers you, I'm almost certain you could eliminate that by fiddling with the knobs that attach the universal support to the sharpener. This is the other orientation, the horizontal orientation. These are the knobs I neglected to use on the other one. And I did the same thing. I just checked to see if they're parallel, and this one was actually spot on. Pretty impressive. So now I'm moving to preparing the stropping wheel. The first thing you got to do is put some oil on it to make it nice and supple. I had some 3-in-1 oil lying around, and I put it on a paper towel and just applied it and rubbed it in. The manual suggests you do the same thing while the wheel is spinning in the opposite direction, so I did that as well. The next step is to apply the honing paste. I did it with my finger, and then I just went ahead and used a chisel to rub that in. So this is the hand plane, blade, and chisel jig. The way it works is you put your chisel or your plane iron in the thing and you push it all the way to the right, and it hits up against this indexing portion, 2 spots on the front and the back. You clamp it down, you slide it on the universal support, and you get to sharpening. One thing to note, this is the portion that slides onto the bar. It looks like it's cracked and defective, but I think this is actually a design feature to allow this to sort of expand and get a nice snug fit. At least I'm giving WEN the benefit of the doubt here. It certainly didn't impede me at all, and in fact, it helped to get a snug fit. In fact, too snug a fit. When I put it on initially, you can see as I pull it, the whole machine kind of moves. So you might want to consider putting down some paste wax or some sort of lubricant to make sure this slides easier. It got better as I kept using the jig, but initially it was a little tight. So this is something you're probably going to need to do each time you mount something in this jig. You're going to need to make sure that whatever you're mounting is exactly perpendicular to that wheel, because if it's not, you're going to grind a slant, and that's no good. So I put my precision edge up against the index of this jig. I folded it down, and it looks pretty good. To the extent it's not flush, you can always sort of finagle that using the knobs, but this is probably something you're going to need to do each time you mount something in this jig. But what if you want to sharpen more than just chisels and plane irons? Well, you need to buy an accessory kit, probably. WEN sells one, and it's model 42704B. And it came to my door very well packaged. Nothing was missing or damaged. It includes a manual to explain how to use each jig. And there are 4 separate jigs. This is jig 1, the scissor sharpening jig, sort of part 1. This is part 2 of it. Jig 2 is a large knife sharpening jig for things like kitchen knives. Then there's a small knife sharpening jig for pocket knives and everyday carries. And then finally, an axe sharpening jig. I also purchased a stone grater. What a stone grater does is help set the grit of the grinding wheel. And typically, there are 2 sides, a rough side and a smooth side. This side is the rough side, and the other side is the smooth side. If you want to set the wheel rougher to take off more material, you would use the rough side and press it against your grinding wheel for a few seconds. If you wanted to make your wheel smoother to remove less material, make more of a finer sharpen, then you would use the finer side, press it against the wheel, and it would remove less material. This does in fact work, although I do not know exactly to what grit this sets this particular wheel. So now I'm going to attach the basin. It's been a day and the epoxy is dried. Tip 1, get a big ass jug of water and have that with you whenever you sharpen. You will be absolutely amazed at how much water this thing sucks up initially and how much water you're going to need to add throughout your sharpening session. So trust me, get a big ass jug. So now it's time to sharpen. I've chosen to sharpen a kitchen knife because I use one pretty much every single day and they wear out quickly. This is actually my older, cheaper knife that I haven't used in some time. I also have my beater chisel, which as you can see, I sort of ground a slant on at some point. So I'd like to try and remove that. And then I have my plane iron. This is for my Stanley No. 4 hand plane, which is in very good shape and actually pretty sharp. But not for long, because I'm going to take a hatchet and I'm going to beat the absolute shit out of each edge of these tools and sort of dull it and roughen it up because I want to see how well this thing does at rehabilitating. I really cringed when I did it to my plane iron just because it was in such good shape. And I think these sharpening gods were looking down on me negatively because as you can see, I almost chopped off my finger. So just be careful if you're going to do something stupid like this. Make sure you don't lose a finger. So as you can see, the blades on all three tools don't really cut much of anything anymore. So this is going to be more restoring than it is just touching up. So first up is the plane iron. I put it in the jig, push it all the way to the right so it contacts the two indexing points. And just so you know what I'm talking about, one of them is right here. And one's right here. These are the 2 points of contact that the blade needs to be hitting. So then I set the angle to 25 degrees, easy enough to do. It says right on the jig what the corresponding angle is, and you just hold the jig against the blade until you don't see any daylight, then you're ready to sharpen. Make sure you hear a grinding sound like this while you're sharpening or else you're not really removing much material. It took me about 2 minutes to remove about this much material, so I decided to dress up the wheel with the stone grater in the hopes that that would maybe speed things along. As you can see here, this makes just a tremendous mess, so I sort of changed up my method a few steps later. But I kept on sharpening, and it was very, very slow going. I think that's because I just didn't have the blade set close enough to the wheel. And also the jig was a little tight on the bar. If you can see right here, I'm sort of twisting it. It's not really going smooth across that bar. That's because it was very snug. It loosened up after a while, but I introduced a bit of a slant and actually a cup. And it took me a couple tries to straighten all of that out. So just make sure you're pushing it nice and smooth across that bar. So it took me a good half hour to get to this point, but that was mostly due to my own mistakes, so can't fault the tool for that. Stropping time now, just doing it freehand on the wheel with some honing paste. First I hit the bevel side, and then the back side, and then one more time on the bevel side. If you do it right, you should introduce a bit of a shine to both edges. If you look at the top of the back, you can see it's a little bit shinier at the top, and the bevel seems to be a little shinier than it was. Although with practice, I think I will get better at this. I can still kind of see the point, and I don't feel like this is as sharp as I probably could have made it, and it wasn't as sharp as when this blade came to me, but at least it cuts through paper now. So next up is the chisel, and this is when I encountered my first issue with this tool. I placed the chisel in the jig as far up as it would go against the two registration points. I busted out the angle jig to set the angle to 25, and I saw I had to advance the chisel forward, but I realized I couldn't. The jig was hitting the wheel, so I had to advance the chisel past the second point of registration, which meant I was only hitting it now on one point. And the question is, well, how do I make sure it's perpendicular to the wheel? So I thought about this a bit and decided to not stress too much and just go with what looked right. I busted out a square and just made sure that it looked like it was perpendicular on the left and the right side. This is not an uncommon sized chisel though, so if you have shorter blade, sort of stumpier chisels, this is going to be an issue for you as well. So since I needed to remove a lot of material, I dressed it to the rough side. This is the last time I went perpendicular like this because you can see water just kind of shot everywhere. It was, again, very slow going with this tool as well. This is as much progress I made after about 5 minutes, which doesn't seem like a lot. And after about 30 minutes, I finally got to where it was acceptable. There's still a bit of a slant, but I think it improved a bit. So now I'm dressing the wheel in the way that I would recommend you dress it. It's sort of a skew or a bias. That contains a lot more water. I'm dressing it to the finer side to sort of more finely hone this blade, or finely sharpen this blade, rather. And I did this for about 5 minutes, and the results were maybe a little bit shinier. So here's a side-by-side. This is on the rough side of the wheel. You can see the scratches. And this is on the fine side of the wheel. I think there's a bit of an improvement. I can't really tell, but in any event, I stropped it, and you can still see a bit of a point there, which suggests I need more practice with my sharpening, but at least now, again, like the plane iron, it does finally cut through paper. So last up, we have the kitchen knife. I use the large knife jig. I put the knife in, I push down the blade, which I'd recommend you don't do if the blade's sharp. Tighten the top knob, tighten the bottom knob, make sure it's in there nice and firm, give it a little pull just to make sure it's not going to shake around. And then take it over to the sharpener and set the angle. I set mine for 20 degrees. That's pretty standard for kitchen knives. Because this tool allows you to sharpen two directions, you can sharpen towards you, which will take off more with each pass, and you can tell it's doing that because the water is kicking up the front. Or you can do it away from you, which I'm doing here, to take off less material if you want to make more of a finer sharpen. And you can tell it's doing that because the water's kicking up on the other side. So between the two, it did an okay job. There's still some nicks there, or remnants of nicks rather, but I was getting impatient, so I just took it over to the strop. About 10 minutes worth on the sharpening wheel. Stropped it for about a minute or two on both sides, just freehand. I can still see a bit of a point. Again, that means I probably need to improve my sharpening technique. There are still some nicks there, but on the plus side, it does cut, and I used it with some vegetables after I cleaned it up, and it cut very well. So on a whim, I went and grabbed the kitchen knife that I use every day. This knife has a pretty decent edge. I did not beat it up, so this is more of just a touch-up, probably what I'll be using this tool for mostly going forward, touching up edges that are already solid. I set the wheel to run away from me, so that's removing less material, and I only spent about a minute per side before I took it over to the strop for a quick polish, and I most definitely noticed a difference. This cut through paper and vegetables thereafter very well. So that magnet idea definitely worked. You can see here the magnets captured some metal filings, but a lot of filings made their way to the bottom of the basin. So I think what I'm going to do is extend this idea and epoxy in one long strip of magnet to the bottom of this in order to catch more of those metal filings. I mentioned I impulse bought this. That's because it was on sale for $113 on Home Depot's website. The accessory kit, also from Home Depot's website, was $50, and the stone grater was $33 from Amazon. So all in, this system cost me about $200. Comparing that to other wet-dry grinders, this thing is a steal. Most other grinders are either smaller wheels or cost a lot more. And so for the price, this WEN system, for everything you get, is pretty hard to beat. So concluding with my likes and dislikes. First, the dislikes. One thing I don't like about this system is the fact the stropping wheel wobbles. Now, some might say for $113, you just have to expect things like that. No, you really shouldn't. You're never supposed to expect a tool to operate in a manner that it's not supposed to. And the stropping wheel is not supposed to wobble while in operation, so WEN might want to take a closer look at that. I also didn't like that the chisel jig really isn't designed to accommodate what I feel is a standard size chisel, but certainly shorter or stumpier chisels, because it's just geometrically impossible to register those chisels in the jig against the 2 points of contact and sharpen them to 25 degrees. You have to push the chisel forward and only contact one registration point, and then figure out a way to make sure that the thing is perpendicular to the wheel. Aside from those two things, though, I'm pretty impressed with this tool. The issues I had sharpening and grinding were mostly issues of my own inexperience, and I think I will only get better and more efficient the more I use this tool. The important things are, 1, the grinding wheel is well milled and runs very true. 2, the thing is calibrated pretty well right out of the box, and to the extent you might need to finagle it just a little bit to force it into parallel or perpendicular, it's not that hard to do. You just have to mess with the lock knobs. The thing is quiet, it runs in 2 directions, it's stout, and you get a pretty impressive set of accessories. You get an angle guide, you get a chisel jig, you get honing paste, and all of that can be had for as low as $113. So this is a very good budget-friendly option, and if you're in the market for a wet-dry sharpener, I think you ought to give this one a look.